1,000 years earlier, David has been anointed the king of Israel. He and his men are in Hebron. And he looks up to Jerusalem and he says, man, I want Jerusalem. I want Jerusalem to be the capital of Israel. So David and his guys march against Jerusalem, but the problem is there are people living in Jerusalem. There's a people group called the Jebusites living and inhabiting Jerusalem. And David and his men go up, and let's take a look at this passage, 2 Samuel chapter 5, verses 6 through 8. The king and his men marched to Jerusalem to attack the Jebusites who lived there. And the Jebusites said to David, you will not get in here. Even the blind and the lame can ward you off. For they thought David cannot get in here. Now, I love this. You know, in antiquity, they like to talk trash. You know, they're always just talking junk back and forth. David is a really good one. You remember him in the Valley of Elah with Goliath? He's like, man, who are you, you uncircumcised Philistine? I'm about to beat your behind, and I'm going to chop your head off, and your Philistine mama's ugly. I mean, he's just going for it. He's like giving it to Goliath. He's just letting it go. And so here comes David and the Israelites, and now the Jebusites are talking trash, and notice what they say. Man, David, you and your boys are so weak, even our lame and blind can keep you out. You're not going to be able to get in here and take Jerusalem? Let's keep reading. Nevertheless, David captured the fortress of Zion, which is the city of David. And on that day, David had said, anyone who conquers the Jebusites will have to use the water shaft to reach those lame and blind who are David's enemies. And that is why they say, this is in the Bible, the blind and lame will never enter the palace. See, after all this stuff went down with the Jebusites, David is now the king of Israel. He has the imperial throne. He has imperial authority. And so on the back end of removing the Jebusites, he starts a tradition, a political, cultural, historical, religious tradition that says, you know what? Because of what you said, Jebusites, the lame and the blind will never get into my house. One generation later, Solomon comes along and he's going to build another house. He's going to build God a house. He's going to build the temple. So Solomon follows the tradition that his father David puts in place, but it's no longer that the lame and the blind can't get into the palace. Now the lame and the blind are not allowed in the temple. If you're lame, if you're blind, you don't get in. Sort of following tradition, following the history. So 1,000 years later, everybody say 1,000. How many of you know when Jesus comes for something, he comes at the root? 1,000 years later, Jesus comes to Jerusalem. And he is entering into a city with 1,000-year history, 1,000-year tradition, 1,000-year imperial tradition that says that the lame and the blind cannot get in. Now, if you want to fire Jesus up, start telling people they can't get in. Because he came to seek and save the lost. He came to find us, the Bible says in Luke 15, to joyfully put us on his shoulders and to carry us home. Jesus shows up in a Jerusalem where the lame and the blind are particularly marginalized, where they are particularly outcast. They are separate from, they are other than, they are looked down on twice, 3 times, 4 times. This is the culture that he comes into. And you want to know who Jesus is and what he's like. Man, Jesus rolls up in Jerusalem and he goes, okay, David did this thing 1,000 years ago. I'm going to go find a lame man and a blind man, and I'm going to heal them both so that they can get into the temple, and I'm about to reverse the curse that's 1,000 years old. This is who Jesus is, and this is what he does. If you look up and you see him coming for you, let him put his hands on you. God has not only earned the right to touch your pain, but he's earned the right to touch your 1,000-year pain.